Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most unbelievable stories in modern business history. We're going to look at how a multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry literally almost went extinct overnight, and then unpack the brilliant, calculated strategies that brought it all back from the ashes. So let's just jump right in. Let's kick things off with a number that is just staggering: 97%. That is the catastrophic, mind-boggling drop in North American home video game revenue that happened in just a few short years. Think about that for a second. An entire booming tech sector just evaporated. To really put that 97% drop into perspective, the industry plummeted from an absolute peak of $3.2 billion in 1982 down to a mere $100 million by 1985. It caused massive panic on Wall Street. Dozens of companies went totally bankrupt. Some, like Magnavox, just threw their hands up and abandoned video games entirely. It was an absolute freefall, and honestly, nobody knew where the bottom was. So you're probably wondering, how on earth does a $3.2 billion juggernaut just collapse like that? Well, it was a vicious cycle. We had this massive oversupply of hardware that was just totally confusing consumers, combined with a complete loss of publishing control. Store shelves were completely flooded with terrible, unauthorized shovelware, and at the exact same time, the PC market was surging, offering way better computing power. All the while, gaming executives just blindly assumed the bubble would never burst. Now, Atari was the undeniable face of this whole mess. I mean, despite holding a massive 70 to 80% market share, they suffered a $536 million loss in 1983 alone. Behind the scenes, their management had shifted away from the engineers to corporate executives who frankly lacked technical understanding. They just prioritized quantity over quality. And this unchecked overproduction ultimately led to one of the most infamous events in tech history: Atari literally burying truckloads of unsold, economically worthless game cartridges out in a New Mexico landfill. Things got so incredibly bleak following Atari's collapse that by 1985, conventional wisdom in America basically declared video games were a dead fad. Seriously, they were viewed no differently than pet rocks or CB radios. Major retailers, most notably Toys R Us, slashed their shelf space for gaming products or just eliminated it entirely. Consumers were waiting for the dust to settle, so sales dropped, companies cut budgets, and the games got even worse. Retailers wanted absolutely nothing to do with video games ever again. But right here is where the story takes a super fascinating turn, because this big crash, it was almost entirely a North American phenomenon. Across the Pacific over in Japan, the gaming market was completely unaffected. In fact, buoyed by a strong economic bubble, their home console industry was thriving and growing rapidly. Right in the middle of this total American meltdown, on July 15, 1983, a company founded over a century ago to make playing cards launched a brand new console in Japan. That company was Nintendo, and the console was the Famicom. It was an immediate, massive success, and a huge part of that was because Nintendo strictly curated their game library. They knew that to survive, they absolutely had to avoid the exact same oversaturation of awful games that had just completely annihilated the market in the West. But here's the catch. Nintendo wanted in on the American market, and US retailers, like we talked about, they were completely traumatized. So Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi masterminded this brilliant Trojan horse strategy. He basically disguised their highly powerful computer as a harmless, family-friendly toy. They redesigned the Famicom's casing so it looked more like a front-loading VCR, which was super familiar in American living rooms. They bundled it with a physical robot toy named ROB, and they completely stopped calling it a video game console. Instead, they dubbed it the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. Now, even with that clever disguise, retailers were still completely terrified of getting stuck with dead inventory. Enter Nintendo executive Minoru Arakawa with a massive gamble. He offered a 100% money-back guarantee to New York retailers for any unsold stock. It was a huge risk, but it worked perfectly. They moved 50,000 units during the 1985 holiday season, and that was it. That was the spark the industry needed. It proved the American market wasn't actually dead. It just needed to be able to trust the product again. To make sure that consumer trust stayed rock solid, and to totally avoid the shovelware disaster that killed Atari, Nintendo introduced a real game changer: the Nintendo Seal of Quality. They severely restricted developer freedom. Suddenly, third-party developers were limited in the number of games they could release every year, and Nintendo themselves controlled the manufacturing of all the cartridges. This kind of strict platform curation is a standard that echoes through every single console generation to this very day. And you know what? This strategy was an absolute masterclass in market rehab.
By 1988, Nintendo had almost single-handedly revitalized the entire American video game market. They captured an astounding 90% market share. They were basically printing money, holding this absolute iron-fisted control over the industry. But, as we all know, in the tech world, a strict monopoly rarely goes unchallenged for long. Enter Sega. In August 1989, Sega launched their 16-bit Genesis console right into the US market, setting the ultimate stage for the legendary console wars. Sega's US leadership was smart. They knew they absolutely couldn't beat Nintendo by just copying them, since Nintendo had the whole family-friendly market completely locked down. So Sega of America deliberately went the other way. They targeted older teenagers and cultivated this edgy, rebellious image. They heavily highlighted the technological superiority of their 16-bit processor, promising way better graphics and arcade-quality sound that Nintendo's aging 8-bit NES simply couldn't compete with. They perfectly captured this whole edgy vibe in one of the most famous marketing campaigns of all time. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It was aggressive, it was totally in your face, and it spoke directly to a whole generation of kids who wanted something just a little cooler and more mature than what Nintendo was giving them.
But hey, marketing is only half the battle, right? You actually need the software to back it up. So Sega secured exclusive arcade ports, licensed major sports titles, and then, in 1991, they debuted their Magic Bullet, a high-speed mascot explicitly designed to show off their processor speed, Sonic the Hedgehog. Powered by these hyper-aggressive tactics and some genuinely incredible games, Sega actually managed to dethrone the king, capturing over 60% of the North American market by 1992. When you step back and look at it, the rapid rebirth of this industry is just breathtaking. I mean, in less than a single decade, the North American market went from a $100 million wasteland with games literally buried in the dirt to a multi-billion-dollar cultural juggernaut. It was a recovery defined by strict quality control and these fierce corporate rivalries that ended up pushing both technology and marketing to incredible new heights. So what's the big takeaway for us today? Well, this incredible history proves that consumer trust is incredibly fragile, and it is super expensive to rebuild once it's gone. Which leaves us with a fascinating and maybe a little provocative question for today's landscape. As modern digital platforms increasingly step away from strict curation, allowing thousands of unchecked games to flood our digital storefronts every single week, could history eventually repeat itself? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you browse your favorite digital game store. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.